Stop motion is an animation technique used by filmmakers to simulate movement of stationary objects. The camera is repeatedly stopped and started to capture the movement of physical objects as they change positions. When the frames are played back rapidly in succession, it creates the illusion that the objects are actually moving on their own. This technique dates back to 1898 with the Humpty Dumpty Circus, directed by J. Stuart Blackton and Albert E. Smith. Although today only still shots from the film remain, Blackton stated that they used his daughter's set of wooden circus performers and animals whose movable joints enabled them to put them in a balanced position. 4 years later, George Méliès's A Trip to the Moon was released, including one of the most famous uses of stop motion, where the space capsule lands on the moon, piercing it in its eye. While there have been many stop-motion films created over the years since 1902, one of the most famous works that helped to popularize the technique is Rankin Bass's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which was released in 1964. In order to create the film, the two worked with animator Tadahito Mochinaga, who developed what was dubbed as animagic, a process which consisted of creating puppets and moving them one frame at a time to create the illusion of motion. The film featured 22 handmade sets, along with 82 different puppets created by designer Ichiro Komura, using materials like wood, wire, cloth, leather, and yak hair. Mochinaga traveled to a deer sanctuary in Japan to study the creature's movements and ensure that those of the puppets would be true to life. Rankin Bass's production inspired more filmmakers to try their hand at telling their stories through stop motion, including Henry Selick, who made his directorial debut in 1993 with Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Selick made use of the replacement technique with his puppets, a method first used by American filmmaker Howard S. Moss in 1917. Around 400 different heads were created for Jack Skellington, the main character of the film, in order to capture each and every facial expression the film called for. In order to help animators understand which head to use, they put a picture of each head onto a computer screen so they could perfectly pick which head would fit each syllable of dialogue.
Oh, somewhere deep inside of these bones, an emptiness began to grow.
The film took over 3 years to make, and in the end, they had utilized 19 sound stages for their 230 sets and had created around 200 puppets. Each puppet had an armature inside of it, or a metal framework that allows animators to move the characters as if they actually have joints. Creating multiples of each puppet allowed animators to simultaneously work on different scenes with the same character on different sets. Animators would often act out the movements of the characters themselves, and then try to duplicate them using the puppets several different ways to make movements as smooth as possible. This makes the process even more painstaking, as they have to film multiple tests of the scene to make sure the director is content with how the characters are moving, while making sure other factors like lighting and camera movements are maintained. The character of Oogie Boogie in particular was a nightmare for animators, as it took months to make sure the shots were correct when he tore off his exterior to reveal the bugs underneath. They not only had to worry about Oogie Boogie's movements at that point, but also each individual bug.
We're shooting at 24 frames a second, which means that we have to pose the character 24 times for each second of actual completed film.
The crew would work for an entire week just to create 1 minute of the film. In the end, the animators ended up with 110,000 frames in order to make the 76-minute feature.
Apologize at once, Coraline. No!
In 2009, Selick took on an even bigger project with Leica, one of the most innovative American stop-motion animation studios, Coraline. Selick was actually invited to work on the project by Neil Gaiman because of his work on Nightmare. While the film was in the making for 4 years, principal photography took only 18 months thanks to the 30 animators Selick had by his side throughout the process to capture the film's 130,000 frames. One of the biggest differences between Coraline and Selick's last projects was that the film was made to be seen in 3D by audiences, making it the first stop-motion film to use stereoscopic photography. This method consists of taking left and right eye images of each frame and aligning them for stereo 3D projection. An advancement in technology that made things a bit easier for the animators on Coraline was the invention of 3D printing. Crew members were able to digitally design each individual face that was needed for the film and then print them as physical resin materials. This didn't relieve the artists of all of the painstaking puppet designing, however, as they still had to hand paint each and every printed face. A total of 15,000 replacement faces were created for all of the characters, and Coraline herself had over 6,300 faces, as well as 24 identical puppets. Clothing was another detail that took time to perfect, and Althea Crome revealed that it took her anywhere between 6 weeks and 6 months to design and knit some of the sweaters for the film. Since the pieces were so small, she would have to use needles that were the size of a human hair to get the job done. In the end, the film had around 150 different sets, including the Pink Mansion, Bobinski Circus, and April and Miriam's Theater. One of the most impressive feats of Coraline, however, is the Fantasy Garden. Selick and the crew had to create around 3,500 fake flowers that all lit up for the scene, and they certainly found creative ways to get the job done. For example, they used simple dog toys to replicate the motion of a flower opening up. 2009 wasn't just a good year for Selick, however. Director Wes Anderson decided to try his hand at creating a stop-motion film with Fantastic Mr. Fox. In his interview with Wes Anderson for his book entitled The Wes Anderson Collection, Matt Zoller Seitz discusses the puppets used in the movie. When asked about the puppets in the sets, Anderson talked about the use of forced perspective in the film. The main Mr. Fox, for instance, was just over a foot high, and most of the sets were on that scale. However, they did have multiple versions of the Mr. Fox puppet to utilize for shots, for example, where the character was supposed to be in the background or foreground of the scene. In the end, 535 puppets were made for the film, as well as around 120 different sets. The film took 2 years to complete shooting, as animators were filming around 6 seconds every 2 days, partly due to Anderson's attention to detail when it came to placing props. Animators also had to learn to make materials like cling film look like water, pear soap look like flames, and cotton wool look like smoke. Technicians had to be creative when finding ways to arrange the puppets for certain scenes that proved to be difficult due to the characters' designs. For example, the puppets would be controlled using small braces that would then be removed by editors later on in the production process so as to not mess up their clothes or hair, which was made from a mix of real and fake animal fur. McKinnon and Saunders, the team behind the creation of the puppets for the project, made use of armatures made from Swiss watch parts for the joints of the characters, as well as plasticine and fiberglass to perfect each model. Similarly to Coraline, costume designers on the project had to knit the clothing for each character using the smallest needles imaginable. Fantastic Mr. Fox proved to be a huge success, and Anderson went on to create another stop-motion animation film in 2018, Isle of Dogs. The film was completed over the span of 2.5 years and made use of 2,200 puppets, 240 sets, and 44 stages. Unlike in Anderson's previous project, the animals in this film don't take on many human characteristics besides being able to talk. Animators had to study dogs to learn how to properly replicate their movements when running, sitting, scratching, etc. Although he could have had many elements of the film created using CG, Anderson was dedicated to making the film look as realistic as possible, once again finding practical ways to create things like smoke and water. While the human puppets all had 3D painted replacement faces, things were a bit more challenging when it came to the dogs. Each had a metal armature on the inside, but their faces and fur had to be moved using pins. Head of Puppets Andy Gent says they used alpaca and mohair as well as merino wool fur from a stuffed animal manufacturer that could be dyed in hundreds of colors needed to create the dog puppets. One of the most famous scenes in the film, and perhaps one of the most impressive stop-motion scenes to date, is the sushi scene, a 40-second scene which took animators 7 months to complete. One of the most difficult parts was figuring out how to put gloves on the chef, and they ended up creating multiple gloves and swapping them out based on the puppet's hand movements. With films like Kubo and the Two Strings, Missing Link, and even an upcoming feature from Selick titled Wendell in the Wild, it's safe to say that stop-motion animation isn't going anywhere anytime soon.